mentioned Jon Stewart. The two of you have a bit of a history. I don't know if you've seen it, but he kind of grilled your supermarket and Subway videos. Have you got any chance to see it?
I haven't seen it, but someone characterized it to me, which is why I pivoted against it earlier in our conversation about how the price of freedom is living in filth and chaos.
Yeah, that was essentially it. So in 2004, that's 20 years ago, Jon Stewart appeared on Crossfire, a show you hosted. And that was kind of a memorable moment. Can you tell the saga of that as you remember it?
I mean, for me, as I was saying to you before about how it takes a long time to digest and process and understand what happens to you, or at least it does for me. I didn't understand that as a particularly significant moment while it was happening. I just got off on a plane from Hawaii. I mean, I was out of it as usual. And I was very literal as usual. And so from my perspective, his criticism of me, to the extent I remember it, was that I was a partisan. Well, he had two criticisms. One, that Crossfire was stupid, which it certainly was. In fact, I'd already given my notice and I was moving on to another company by that point. Crossfire was stupid. Crossfire didn't help. Crossfire framed everything as Republican versus Democrat. Whatever. It was not helpful to the public discourse. I couldn't agree more. And that's why I left. So that was part of his critique. Fair. I'm not sure I would have admitted it at the time because I worked there, and it's sort of hard to admit you're engaged in an enterprise that's like fundamentally worthless, which it was. But his other point was that I was somehow a partisan or a mindless partisan, which is definitely not true. It is true of him. He is a mindless partisan, but I am not. And I really haven't been since I got back from Baghdad at the beginning of the Iraq War. And I realized that the Republican Party, which I'd voted for, my whole life to that point and had supported in general, was like pushing this really horrible thing that was going to hurt the United States, which in time it really did. The Iraq War really hurt the United States. And I realized that I had been on the wrong side of it. I said so publicly immediately from Baghdad. I said that to the New York Times, and I really meant it. I mean it now. And so to call me partisan, you could call me stupid. You could call me wrong. I certainly have been wrong, but partisan, I just didn't think it was a meaningful. I mean, it's like, that's just not true. It's the opposite of true. So I didn't really take it seriously at all. And I never thought much of him. So I was like, whatever, some buffoon jumping around on my show, grandstanding. But I do think it was recorded. And by the way, that happened right at the moment that YouTube began. I think that was one of the first big YouTube videos. It was one of the first big YouTube videos. So it had a virality that, if that's a word, it went everywhere in a way that didn't used to happen in cable news. I mean, by that point, that was 20 years ago, as you point out. I've been in cable news for 9 years. So before 2004, we would say something on television and then it would be lost. Like people could claim they heard it, but you'd have to go to the University of Tennessee at Knoxville archives to get it. Suddenly, everything we said would live forever on the internet, which is good, by the way. That's not bad, but it was a big change for me. And I just couldn't believe how widely that was discussed at the time, because I thought he was not an interesting person. I think he's obviously a very unhappy person. I just didn't take him seriously then, and I don't now. But so anyway, that was it. It was a smaller thing in my life at the time than other people imagine.
Okay, you said a lot of words that will make it sound like you're a bit bitter, even if you're not. So you said unhappy person,
well, I
partisan
think he's an
person.
Unhappy guy. Well, he's definitely partisan for sure.
So can you elaborate why you think he's
partisan?
partisan?
So I think that, and I see this a lot, not only on the left, but people who believe that whatever political debate they're engaged in is the most important debate in the world. And so they bring an emotional intensity to those debates, and they're inevitably disappointed because no eternal question is solved politically. So they're kind of on the wrong path, right? And they're doomed to frustration if they believe that. And many do. He certainly does. That whatever the issue is so, Clarence Thomas should not be Supreme Court Justice. And the implication is, well, if someone else is Supreme Court Justice, we'll live in a fair and happy society. But that's just not, it's a false promise. So I think that people who bring that level of intensity to politics are by definition bitter, by definition disappointed, bitter in the way that disappointed people are. And that the real questions are like, what happens when you die? And how do the people around you feel about you? Those are those are not the only questions in life, but they're certainly the most important ones. Mm-hmm. And if we're spending a disproportionate amount of time on who gets elected to some office, not that it's irrelevant, it is relevant, but it's not the eternal question. And so I feel like he's not the only kind of bitter, silly person in Washington or in its orbit. There are many, and a lot of them are Republicans. So, but I just thought it was ironic. I mean, everything's ironic to me, but like being called a Russia sympathizer by a guy who calls himself Boris, like it just made me laugh. No one else has ever laughed at that. Boris Johnson's real name is not Boris, as you know. He calls himself Boris. It's his middle name. And so like, if you call yourself Boris, you don't really have standing to attack anyone else as a Russia defender, right? I think that's funny. No one else, as I noted, does. But Jon Stewart, like, if he, there are a lot of things you could say about me, but he's much more partisan than I am. So to call me a partisan is like, what?
He would probably say that he's not a partisan, that he's a comedian who's looking for the humor and the absurdity of the system.
That's a dodge.
On both sides.
He's he's a very serious person in this. I will say this, and he shares this quality with a lot of comedians. I know a lot of comedians. I know a cross-section of people just having done this job for a long time. And a lot of them are very serious, like about their views, and they have a lot of emotional intensity. And he certainly is in that category. He's not, that's like the silliest thing. Yeah, he's a comedian for sure. He can be very funny for sure. He has talent, no doubt about it. I've never denied that. But he's motivated by his moral views. This is right, that is wrong. And I just think it's a misapplied passion.
Snap your W-2 and